Hello, everyone, and welcome to Untap Those Wires, How to Reduce CIPA Risk with Your CMP. My name is Matt Davis. I'm the marketing content lead at Osano, but I'm not the star of the show today. I'll be introducing those folks in just a sec. First, some quick housekeeping announcements. I want to direct your attention to the right side of the screen where you should see a chat window, as well as a space to put in Q&A, questions that you might have over the course of the webinar today. Additionally, in the files section of that tab, you'll find a file containing the slides of today's presentation. So if you want to save those for later, you can download them there, or we'll be sending those to you in follow-up emails, as well as a checklist of today's guidance. So with that out of the way, I'm going to pass it over to Mark and Skye.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Matt. I appreciate it. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Skye McCullough, and I am the Chief Customer Officer at Osano. I have with me Mark Brown. Mark, do you want to take a quick second to introduce yourself to the class?
Yeah. Hey, everybody. I'm Mark. I've been working in data privacy and with Osano for about 6 years now. And today I work closely with our customers as a customer success manager. And I'm excited to spend some time with you today talking about wiretapping laws and hopefully leave you with some takeaways that you can actually use.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. I'm happy to have you here with me today. So as Mark mentioned, we are here today to talk about something that's been showing up more and more in conversations we've been having with our customers, and that's specifically wiretapping laws. And we're going to focus a little bit on CIPA or CIPA today and how they're being applied to modern websites. So if you've ever wondered, could our analytics setup actually trigger a lawsuit, or why am I suddenly hearing about a 1960s wiretapping law in 2026? You're not alone, and you're definitely in the right place. So later in this session, you'll hear from Mark, who, as he mentioned, works directly with our customers on cookie consent configurations and on audit response. He's going to walk through what actually reduces risk in practice from a consent perspective within Osano specifically, but will also offer some insight on better overall risk reduction that can apply basically to anyone in the ways that make sense for your org. Mark, you want to give a little additional details about what we'll be going into today?
Yeah, sure. So here's what we'll cover today. First, we will level set on what CIPA and similar laws actually are and how they differ from state privacy laws like CCPA. And then we'll talk about what we're seeing in the real world. So how these lawsuits actually show up, who's getting targeted and why. And after that, we'll switch gears and get very practical. Like Skye mentioned, I'm going to walk you through how to configure your CMP to reduce CIPA risk. And that will include things like what to prioritize, what teams often miss, and then we will wrap with some Q&A.
And then as Matt mentioned in the chat there, all of these slides or recording of the webinar will be shared after the fact as well. And if we have any follow-up materials, we'll kind of touch on some of those at the end, and that information will be sent to you as well after the fact.
Yeah, before we go any further, though, we do want to take a quick poll and get a sense of where everyone's starting from. So on a scale from 1 to 5, how prepared do you feel if you were to receive a CIPA claim tomorrow? So would you know what it actually triggered the claim, what to look at in audit, what evidence you need to gather, and what steps you need to take? And this is anonymous, so you can be honest. We commonly see a full range of answers here. There's no shame.
Yeah, and it looks like it's about across the board. It's about a gamut. Not one is winning over the other. Although we got some middle ground, which is about right. So that's pretty much exactly what we see across the board. And I think what Mark's going to kind of talk about a little bit later is that most of what moves that number from maybe a 3 to a 4 or maybe a 2 to a 3 is configuration and process. It's not really legal gymnastics. It's what you can actually technically accomplish now during technical due diligence that kind of saves you in the future, which is why we'll take the second half of today's conversation to be a little bit more practical. All righty. So Again, like I said, this is pretty consistent with our own customer base. There's a lot of uncertainty on CIPA, specifically on what applies, what doesn't apply, what does it mean, what should I be looking for. So before we jump too far into anything, let's take a second to lay a little bit of groundwork. If we're going to understand the risk, we have to understand the regulation and why it keeps surprising people. So let's talk about CIPA. So CIPA, or you might hear it as CIPA or CIPA. I say CIPA, but it stands for the California Invasion of Privacy Act. So that was passed in 1967, and it was originally designed to prevent telephone wiretapping or secret recordings. So in its original form, go think physical phone taps, bugs, recording devices. This is all very Watergate, right? So quit gut check, drop a little thumbs up in the chat if you already knew that we had a 1967 wiretapping law that applied to modern day websites. And if this is brand new information for you, you're definitely not alone. This was a pretty new thing for me when I first came across it, but nowadays it's become a little bit old hat. I'm almost want to ask you to drop a smiley face in the chat if you know what Watergate is that I just referenced, because I did reference it to my team earlier this week and I got a lot of blank looks. So I want to make sure we have some historians in the house to have some context there. But to be fair, CIPA does predate the moon landing, so it's basically ancient. So we want to talk about why it applies today, right? What's the challenge of it today? And the main challenge is that plaintiffs are arguing that web technologies, things that didn't exist in the 60s, like session replay, analytics scripts, chat widgets, they're today's modern digital equivalent to those wiretaps. And because of that, CIPA is going to come into play. So overall, CIPA applies to any business that is accessible to a California resident. This is a lot like CPRA, right? Regardless of where you are headquartered, if you are doing business with California, CIPA is going to apply to you. So that extraterritorial reach is why out-of-state companies are frequent targets. Again, just because you aren't in California doesn't mean you're not doing business with California. And it's a lot more natural for a Californian business to be more up to date on California privacy law. Why wouldn't they be? And to operate their website in a way that is aware of those regulations. So out-of-staters tend to be the easier targets just because of the lack of access. And more importantly, CIPA also has a private right of action with statutory damages of $5,000 per violation or 3 times the actual damage. Private right of action is where this gets a little bit scary. It's that scary phrase to look for in regulations because class actions can involve thousands of users very quickly. That exposure escalates quite quickly. One person can become 1,000 in the blink of an eye. So let's talk a little bit about how CIPA is being applied in the real world. We've got 2 main legal theories that we see. The first is eavesdropping and recording. And this is the idea that tools like session replay or chat widgets are recording communications between a user and a website. So this could be any data that you are sending to third parties in that manner. The second and more recent interpretation is going to involve pen registers or trap and trace devices. And, the jury's out if I'm going to say trap and trace correctly multiple times over this conversation. But this is where pixels, cookies, SDKs, or fingerprinting scripts are treated as mechanisms that capture routing or signal information. So think of this as anything that could record things like incoming telephone numbers or electronic signals like IP addresses to identify the source of a communication, right? That really expands the reach of what we're talking about when we refer to pen registers and trap and trace when we apply it to these modern terms. So this is going to be things like your Facebook pixels, your LinkedIn pixels, anything that could be sending data to a third party in this manner. So as I'm talking about this, I'd like you to think about your own website's digital properties. Do you have anything that could be considered session replay? This could be something like Pendo, PostHog, Amplitude. All of these tools have some sort of session replay technology embedded in them. You might not be using it, but you could be, right? Do you have any sales or marketing chats or even a support chat that is accessible on your main pages? Do you have social media pixels? That one's probably the most common, right? The social media pixels. And again, you don't have to answer out loud here, but just mentally note how many of those boxes that you're checking right now. And that'll be a good start to itemize your risk vectors when you eventually go and audit your site to make sure that you are CIPA compliant. So courts have gone back and forth on these theories, but there is one pretty common thread here, and that is that applying an opt-in consent standard before data collection occurs is the strongest protection against both of these approaches. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about practical approaches in the future when I throw it over to Mark. But just keep that in mind that when we talk about CIPA and other wiretapping laws, consent and disclosure are going to be two of the big themes that we're going to see and talk about. So here's where a lot of people sort of get tripped up. CIPA exists alongside other laws that kind of compound it, right? VPPA is one that's gotten a lot of notice in the news recently. That focuses on video viewing history and now is used more for organizations that have a lot of video content on their websites or showing a lot of media on their websites. You've also got ECPA, which is a federal wiretapping law. And then there are similar state wiretap statutes in place in places like Florida and Pennsylvania. So all of these laws are fundamentally different from modern state privacy laws, which primarily rely on opt-out consent models, meaning you can just be tracking users at any given time as long as you're giving them the option to opt out at some point. Most of these kind of exist in that space. But while you might be compliant with those laws and other state frameworks, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be protected from wiretap-based claims. So it's not uncommon to see these kind of stacked on top of one another, a CIPA and a VPPA kind of come together, or a CIPA and an ECPA kind of come together. So the guidance that we're sharing today and what Mark's going to talk about a little bit later on is going to go beyond those minimum state privacy laws. And that's kind of intentional to support these more complex wiretapping scenarios. So let's zoom out for a moment really quickly. We've noticed that since 2022, there have been nearly 4,000 wiretap lawsuits filed in the US. The majority of these are going to be in California, which is kind of expected, right? And that's going to be followed by Florida and Illinois. Retail is overwhelmingly the most targeted sector. Again, that makes sense. It's a very B2C business when we're talking about retail. You're working with a lot of individuals. And again, that private right of action comes into play. So the more people you are exposed to, the more actionality they have, right? But technology is also the second most common target. So that's why we're seeing a lot more attention in SaaS spaces and digital first companies, right? Technology and retail, B2B or B2C businesses are going to have a lot of that sort of exposure and a lot of that risk. So this data comes from a Fisher Phillips digital wiretapping litigation map, which I believe we'll be sending out after this presentation so that you can get a little deeper look into it if you'd like to give it a look. But it does reflect a sustained trend, right? Not a short-term spike. This is something that's continuously growing, not just something that happened once and then disappeared. So the really important part here that I do want to call out is that these numbers represent actual lawsuits that were formally filed in courts, right? So they don't include pre-suit demand letters, informal claims, or matters that were resolved outside of the court systems. So in practice, a lot of CIPA claims actually happen before anything is ever filed. Most companies are going to receive things like demand letters alleging a CIPA violation, and they're going to choose to resolve it quietly through a settlement or some sort of remediation rather than letting it turn into a public lawsuit. So it's a lot easier and cheaper in a lot of cases to just pay the $5,000 that someone is asking for than to spend hours with your external counsel discussing how to proceed, which obviously could run you significantly higher than $5,000 that this particular claimant is asking for. So when that happens, there's no court filing and it never shows up in data sets like this. And when we look at this chart, what we're seeing is really just a visible portion of a larger activity. And I don't say that to be like scary here, right? It's just important context to understand is that this risk is visible here, but there is a risk beyond that that isn't hypothetical and isn't limited to just a handful of edge cases. But those edge cases are the most costly for sure. So that's why we see them up here. And that's of why we're going to be spending time on this today. It's we want to understand the scope to make it easier for us and for the teams that we need to influence down the line, understand the why behind what we're recommending that they do, right? Internal buy-in is difficult when it comes to privacy in a lot of cases, especially because, as I'm sure most of you know, a lot of times we're fighting with marketing teams and sales teams and front-end IT teams, and we all have our own priorities. So there's a lot of negotiation that has to happen here. And sometimes the things that we want to do from a risk aversion perspective aren't necessarily the same things that we want to do from a revenue perspective. So what we're seeing in the wild, there's a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, right? There has been some pushback. Some Californian courts have rejected more overly broad interpretations of CIPA, and legislators have attempted to modernize the law a little bit. But the bill that we'd seen to modernize this law, or to modernize CIPA, was paused after it got some backlash and some criticism from privacy advocacy groups. And there are currently no active legislative proposals to revise how CIPA applies to digital technologies. So you've got that on one hand. At the same time, courts are still allowing cases to proceed. Cases like Camp Listen versus Adidas was kept the door open for those class action filings. And we know that those demand letters that I mentioned earlier are kind of a hot ticket right now. So the bottom line is that courts and legislators recognize the tension here, but until reform happens, businesses just have to adapt to the current reality and mitigate risk where they can. So this all comes again back to the level of risk that you are willing to accept, and risk aversion where you can get it. So here at Osano, we work pretty closely with our customers where we can, whenever they're concerned about their privacy posture. So when a customer receives a notice from a regulator or a law firm, or even what we call internally an opportunistic individual, right? We like to help guide through responses and remediations where we can as they relate to your tooling, and support where we can, right? So because of that and the work that we do with our partners, we have a front row seat to how some of these cases actually start, or how claims are submitted when it comes to CIPA. And one thing that consistently stands out is that most people don't even realize that they're exposed until a notice arrives. And a lot of the time that is, a lot of misconfiguration or misunderstanding when it comes to their own properties. It's rarely intentional behavior, right? It's hardly ever something that you set out to do. It is more often than not an assumption that was made years ago, or changes to a website that were never re-audited through a wiretapping lens. So it could be that, you got GDPR compliant 6 years ago, you haven't really made that many changes to your website since then, or you got CPRA compliant, and in the back of your head, you said that'll hit it, that'll cover everything. And then CIPA comes along and actually says, well, maybe we'll be a little bit more discerning when it comes to what we're tracking or what we're allowing to happen on our websites going forward. So again, it's not intentional behavior more often than not. We just need to adjust our expectations of our website. So you could have new search features that got added to the page. You have a new marketing tool that gets on, a script fires sooner than expected. Suddenly something that's routine and normal about your website has become the basis for a legal claim. So that said, we kind of have an idea of what to look out for or what to expect on this front, at least when it comes to current state of CIPA notices or CIPA allegations. So here's what a lot of these notices have in common, and we're going to kind of sit on this this particular page for just a moment. I'm not saying that this is going to be the case across the board, but this is what we've seen and what we've heard ourselves, as well as from our legal and regulatory partners when it comes to CIPA claims. The first is how they arrive. So a lot of people will expect that these claims will come through your email, and that will happen. A lot of the times they'll come to your contact us email, or any email that you have on your privacy policy. So listed out in a privacy policy section. Pardon me for one moment. So that will happen, but we also have seen that a lot of these CIPA notices still come through physical mail. So a physical envelope across your desk. And when you open it, the structure is going to be pretty similar to what we've seen. It's typically going to be a notice that alleges a violation of California's Invasion of Privacy Act. It's specifically going to call out section 631A, and it's going to focus on something like a website search bar. It's going to argue that the user's search query is a private communication, or it is going to be a chatbot on the page that is already asking you for more information about you, or some sort of tracking technology like a social media pixel that alleges that it is a trap and trace that we talked about earlier. So from there, the claims are then going to say that those queries were transmitted in real time to some sort of third-party analytic or tracking vendor. Pardon me. The core allegation there, after we talk about that transmission to third-party vendors, is always going to be pretty much the same. It's that no valid prior consent was given, and it's going to maintain that cookie banners or privacy policies are insufficient. So the consent that was gathered was insufficient in that moment. And then it's going to come to the demand, again, $5,000 per violation per third party, plus injunctive relief, which basically means stop doing what you're doing, right? And when you layer that across users and vendors, that number can escalate pretty quickly. So our common risk factors that we see include defaulting to an opt-out consent model, meaning a user shows up to your website and they are being tracked immediately for analytics or targeting activities. This is going to be pixels, cookies, analytics firing before consent. That's one. Sending data to third-party vendors like session replay tools. It's going to be search bars or forms routing data externally, and it's going to be insufficient disclosures. These are our big ones, our big themes here. These claims tend to surge towards the end of the year, and they're almost always driven by class action law firms or by individuals, hardly ever by regulators. You generally don't see an AG sending these types of notices. So that's going to bring us to our most important question, which is what can you actually do? All right. So this is where I take a little bit of a step back here and shift away from regulatory theory to practical action, which I'm sure everyone's so disappointed in. You don't get to hear me talk about regulatory landscape anymore. So I am going to be throwing the mic over to Mark here, and he's going to walk through a framework that we use with our customers to meaningfully reduce CIPA risk, whether you're using Osano or another CMP, and kind of walk through some best practices that we've seen be helpful for our customers. Mark, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
All right. Thank you, Skye. Yeah, this is the part where we move from like, that's all very interesting, maybe a little scary, to what can we actually do about it? And we break CIPA risk reduction into 5 core steps. And these apply whether you're using Osano or really any other CMP. So first, explicit opt-in consent in high-risk jurisdictions like California. This is a big one. So from a wiretap perspective, the question is very simple. It's, did data start flowing before the user clearly said yes? So that means no analytics, no marketing, pixels, no session replay, nothing until consent is granted. And just a note here, pre-consent data collection is where most of these CIPA claims start. Second is to classify every tracker and script. So one of the biggest issues we see is unknown, ignored, or forgotten technologies. If something isn't classified, it often isn't going to be blocked correctly, and that is exposure. Session replay tools, form monitoring, embedded widgets, these are all common blind spots that we've seen. Third is honoring global privacy control and do not track signals. So in California, especially, these signals matter a lot. If your site receives a GPC signal and continues to collect data anyway, that is increasingly hard to defend. Fourth is aligning your privacy disclosures with reality. Your privacy policy should not describe an idealized version of your setup, right? It needs to reflect what's actually happening on the site today. If your CMP categories and your disclosures don't match, again, that's something that plaintiffs tend to notice. And fifth is having a documented subject rights management process. So while this doesn't directly combat a CIPA claim, it can show users that they have a clear, predictable way to object to data collection rather than needing to escalate straight to legal action. It also creates an audit trail that demonstrates when requests were received, how they were handled, and that you did respond in good faith and on time. So again, having a solid subject rights management process won't prevent a CIPA claim on its own, but it definitely strengthens your defensibility and often surfaces confusion before it turns into a lawsuit. All right, so let's look at what this actually looks like in a real CMP. I'm going to walk you through how this looks inside Osano. But again, even if you're not an Osano customer, what I want you to focus on here is the behavior, not necessarily the buttons that I'm clicking on. So these are the controls, again, any CMP needs if it's going to meaningfully reduce CIPA risk. So the first thing I want to show you is what we call strict mode. This is one of, I would say, the most important settings when it comes to wiretap risk, because it answers a very basic question, which is what happens to the things that you forget about. Strict mode blocks all unclassified content by default. So that means if a script, pixel, or any tracker isn't explicitly classified, it's just not going to run for anyone. And that matters because a lot of CIPA exposure doesn't come from tools that you have intentionally enabled, right? It comes from the things that have slipped through the cracks, like old A/B testing scripts, widgets added by marketing, vendor tags that someone meant to go clean up later. And strict mode will remove all that ambiguity. Again, if it's not classified, it will not fire, period. Next, I want to talk about global privacy control and do not track. When these signals are detected, Osano does two very important things. The first is we will provide a visual indicator that the signal was received. And that matters because if you are ever asked, did you honor GPC, you can show it and not just say it. Second, if GPC is detected, targeted advertising will be automatically disabled for that user. And this is especially important in California. Honoring GPC is now a CPRA requirement, and we're seeing increasing scrutiny around whether sites are actually honoring that or and respecting it, or just acknowledging it. From a litigation standpoint, ignoring GPC while you're continuing to collect data is very hard to defend. All right, the next setting I want to show you is not required, but it is strongly recommended, and that is the Manage Preferences button. So the Manage Preferences button, this is going to give the users a persistent way to revisit and adjust their consent choices. And why does this matter for CIPA? Because transparency helps, right? When users can clearly see, control, and change their preferences, it weakens arguments that data collection was hidden or it was deceptive. It's right there in front of them. It also reduces the likelihood that someone feels surprised later, which is often what triggers these types of complaints in the first place. All right, now I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball. You'll notice there's a setting here for US state level opt-out. And for CIPA risk reduction, this should be disabled. And here's why. So in California, and increasingly in other litigious states as well, you want explicit opt-in consent before any tracking occurs. Leaving state level opt-out enabled can result in trackers starting before consent was actually granted, which is exactly where these wiretap claims start, right? That's what they hinge on. And I do want to be very clear about the trade-off here with this particular setting. Disabling this will impact analytics and marketing performance in those states that have their own privacy law. So before you make this change, you typically would need buy-in or at least awareness from the marketing team. So it's a very risk versus data conversion conversation. It's not necessarily a technical one.
And Mark, that's just because trackers that were running prior to consent previously now require that explicit consent option, correct? That's
Exactly.
Because you'd be opting out in cases where previously you were opting in by default.
Exactly. That's very important for California and again, the other states as well, but certainly for CIPA. All right, let's talk about cookie disclosure. Disclosing cookies directly in your consent manager, it adds this like extra layer of transparency, and it's generally a very good practice that's recommended. That said, this is not meant to replace your cookie policy or a privacy policy, right? Your privacy policy still needs to clearly document what personal information you're collecting, how you use it, and how cookies and tracking technologies fit into that picture. If those two things don't align, your CMP and your privacy policy, then that's, again, something that plaintiffs tend to notice. Next, I want to talk about classifying scripts. And I would say that this is probably the most important part of the walkthrough. So I do want to emphasize this, right? You may think a tool is essential to your business, but that doesn't automatically make it essential under privacy law, right? So for example, let's say, there's an A/B testing tool that might be critical for conversion optimization, but if it tracks users across sessions, then essential may not be the right classification for that. And misclassification is one of the most common issues we see during audits. I think I see it on all of them. If something is classified incorrectly, it may fire when it shouldn't, and that is exposure. And this is where we recommend that teams just slow down and be honest about what each tool actually does. All right, finally, I want to show you what this looks like from a user's perspective, coming from a state like California. So this is Osano's website. You can see our cookie banner here. This is the experience that regulators, plaintiffs, and users will actually see. So there's clear notice, there's clear choices, and there's no tracking happening before consent is actually granted by the user. This is what defensibility looks like. Outside of these specific settings, I would encourage you to also make sure that you're following your CMP's installation documentation closely. Even if you've set up everything perfectly, you have the best configuration, it's not going to help if the script is implemented incorrectly. So that's very important as well. Okay, I think we're going to jump back to the presentation now. But before we wrap, I did want to kind of zoom out for a moment, because not everything that matters lives inside Osano or even inside a CMP. If you are using another consent platform or a homegrown solution, really the most important question is still very simple, which is, can your CMP actually enforce explicit opt-in consent in jurisdictions like California? So that means no tracking before consent, no default allow behavior, and no reliance on banners alone. If the honest answer is kind of, or we think so, that's usually where the wiretap risk lives. And it's definitely worth taking a closer look, regardless of which tool you use. Now, outside of your CMP, there are two other things that matter just as much. First is your subject rights management process, right? You need a clearly documented workflow to handle these requests with defined intake paths, clear timelines, and an audit trail. If you receive a request tied to CIPA or really any other privacy law, you need to be able to show when it came in, how it was handled, and that it was completed on time. And second is your privacy policy. This needs to be reviewed at least once a year for accuracy and completeness. Make sure it clearly documents everything that you collect and how you're using it, including cookies, tracking technologies, data sharing, retention. Your CMP and your privacy policy should tell the same story. And Osano does offer tools like Trust Hub and our subject rights management solution that can make these things much easier. Those are back-end workflows. We won't go deep into that today. Really what matters most is that these controls do exist and that they're documented and auditable. Again, no matter which CMP you're using. And if you want help reviewing your specific setup and your account, your CSM or our team is always happy to walk you through it and meet with you. All right, Skye, I'm going to pass it back over to you. I've been talking a lot here.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Mark. So I think some of the things that I do want to just make sure that we touch on or comment on one more time is, sometimes we talk about chief repetition. We got to say things 100 times before they really stick in your brain. But the things that tend to matter the most for CIPA, and this is good practice across the board, right? This is not just CIPA, but if we want to be CPRA compliant, we want to be GDPR compliant, though there is more nuance for GDPR compliance than there might be for this CIPA case. But very specifically, we want to hit on, to Mark's point and some of the points that we made earlier, default opt-out consent models. that is frowned upon in the CIPA world. In a lot of cases, what we want to do is gather appropriate levels of consent before we start tracking our users. And sometimes an alert only banner is going to be enough based on how you are tracking your user, how you are using that user's information, what type of personal information you're gathering, and then who you are sending it to. But in a lot of cases, especially as we evolve and we start interacting with more third-party vendors like Facebooks and Metas of the world, like the LinkedIns of the world, where it becomes a little bit more dicey on how and who we are sharing information with. And in those cases, it is much more risk averse to have a scenario where consent is not assumed, but it is explicitly gathered. So that's like, if you could take one key takeaway from a CIPA claim, is explicitly gathered consent with appropriate disclosure, right? That's the second key portion that I do want to just make sure we triple click on to make sure we're really understanding and hitting that part home. And again, disclosure comes in three different ways and maybe even beyond that. One is some sort of consent management service that tells a user that they are being tracked. That is one thing, or one portion of disclosure. Two is some sort of documentation or some sort of disclosure that tells what information we are gathering and how we are using that information. And then the third is sort of just-in-time alerting. So a lot of chat bots, for example, now have internal checkboxes where you can consent to having a continued communication with that chat box prior to engaging with that chatbot. So there's a bunch of different ways that you might gather additional forms of consent. Use a universal consent mechanism. You could use the internal built consent choices, but I challenge everyone to kind of think back to our previous conversation thought exercise, where you run through the inventory of your website, and you can use a consent manager tool to kind of help you do that, right? To scan your website to see what actually is running there, kind of understand what it's doing on your site. And that gives you an idea of how to disclose that content. Privacy policies are a lot of times one of the most overlooked things that we've got in play, especially for GDPR in particular. Annual reviews are required. It's really easy for those to slip through the cracks, but your website is changing constantly. I can tell you for a fact that we've probably added 3, 4, 5 new tools to various apps and websites over the past year. If we didn't update our privacy policy or our sub-processors list, we would be woefully out of date. So if you haven't looked at your privacy policy in over a year, I would implore you to do that, to make sure that you're understanding what PI you've got, where it's going, what vendors you're working with, what type of information you're sending to those vendors. It's a really good starting point to get an understanding of where your risk vectors are. So to Mark's point there's a lot of built-in best practices. We'll send you some documentation on how to utilize those best practices, what you should be doing, what you should be reviewing. It's a lot of obviously what we've gone over in this presentation, but we do want to take a little bit of time to walk through any Q&A that you might have. If there's anything that we can help with, if you'd like to meet with a member of your team, to Mark's point, we'll give you some content at the end of this presentation, and we're happy to meet with you outside of this webinar as well. Matt, I noticed you just jumped back on.
I did. Yes, I'm here to facilitate Q&A.
Oh, okay.
Thanks for that excellent content, Mark and Skye. Super informative. I know that this is kind of a frustrating topic, so I'm sure that a lot of people have been seeking guidance, and we've got a lot of questions to that effect as well. So if you haven't noticed yet, there's a Q&A tab at the top of the chat window. So if any questions popped up during the course of the webinar today, feel free to just drop them in there. We'll do our best to answer as many as we can. I do want to offer a quick kind of caveat. We can't give anything that's going to be, legal advice or in the nitty gritty of the nature of these lawsuits or anything like that. So, as an example to start off with, I see one of the top voted questions here refers to the trolls issuing demand letters without valid claims. Is there anything in the works for pursuing charges against these trolls for bad faith claims? I'm not aware of any laws in the works that would empower you to do so. There may be a way, there may not be a way. It's something you're going to have to talk about with your legal counsel. But there's certainly a lot of notices going out that are more fishing for something legally actionable than is there or isn't there. But so with that one out of the way,
I'll just make a quick comment on that as well. That in a lot of times for those claims, the two options that you have available, right, and the two things that they're kind of hoping for is pay them out or provide evidence to the contrary. So in a lot of cases, providing evidence to the contrary is a good option, though it takes resources, right? You are going to have to dedicate resources to put together your case, but putting together a case is a lot of the times as easy as paying out. So those are really the two options that these bad faith actors are kind of expecting, is either a payout or some sort of proof against the claim.
Yes. I'm going to summarize a common group of questions that we got regarding customizing your consent banner to geolocation. So, we talked about the trade-off of opt-in banners versus opt-outs, how, you get sort of less risk, but also less data. Skye and Mark, I was wondering if you could talk to us about how Osano handles customizing consent banners based on the jurisdiction involved.
Yeah, I can touch on that a little bit, and then Skye may hop in with some more context. But yeah, Osano does offer a number of ways that you can customize the consent banners based on, a number of different things. Like we talked about the U.S. state level opt-out banner format. Like there are different things that you can customize there, as well as do you want the banner to be a box or an actual banner on the screen, where you want it to show up, the colors, all that stuff is customized within Osano. If you're looking to customize a banner for only California, for example, there are ways to do that, but not necessarily within Osano. There are some CSS changes that you can make on your side that allow you to do some creative things like that. But Skye, do you want to add anything there?
There's state level mapping that is available, and that's generally our recommendation. So at Osano, we use IP address to determine where a user is coming from and then serve a banner that is appropriate for those locations. So we are able to geolocate down to, again, the state level or the country level or the province level if you're in Canada, Law 25 in Quebec. So there is the ability to isolate usage and attempt to gather as much analytics as possible, targeted advertising as possible in the places where maybe they're a little less litigious, while still having the opt-in or opt-out experience be more reflective of the areas that are more litigious. And there are additional, customization opportunities, to Mark's point, that you can have where only California sees that banner, but all other states in the United States see banner number one, if necessary, or banner number one being an implied consent banner. So there is opportunity there to make sure you're kind of mitigating the loss of analytics and marketing. At the end of the day, it is a risk reward way that you have to make with your own internal teams. There are some things like Google. If you are a Google shop, Google has a particular framework called Google Consent Mode that doesn't necessarily mitigate the loss of analytics, but they do offer modeling data for locations where you've opted out, where users have opted out. So you are kind of getting some gaps filled in. Amazon has its own consent mode as well, consent framework as well. I don't have as much information on that one because it's a little bit newer than Google's is. So the level of data that you're getting from it is not as well known as what we're getting from Google. But there are some things that you can put into place that make it a little bit easier to swallow if you're an organization that's really reliant on analytics or marketing technologies.
Awesome. Okay, we have another attendee asking whether we expect that California's Opt Me Out Act would have an effect on CIPA lawsuits. So just as a reminder or an explanation for attendees who may not be familiar, the Opt Me Out Act will require that browsers have native support for universal opt-out preference signals like the GPC or the global privacy control. I know we talked a little bit about how the GPC is somewhat related to CIPA lawsuits and consent management. So yeah, I was wondering what your speculation, maybe if you can discuss how the GPC relates to this in a broader level.
Yeah, I would say that this will be entirely conjecture. I would say that it can reduce exposure if we're talking about the opt me out. I would say it definitely reduces exposure. It's still reliant on technological signals being passed and accepted in the appropriate ways. Do I think this is going to affect CIPA lawsuits? I think, or CIPA claims rather. Short answer is no. I think it is another vector for finding vulnerability, right? I think it might reduce CIPA claims in that if it is a requirement and websites are all being held accountable to those requirements, that CIPA lawsuits will naturally decrease, or CIPA notices will naturally decrease because of the technical due diligence you are doing to support the opt me out. So I think it would be more of a causal relationship than anything. It's in ensuring that we are compliant in one way, we are compliant in another way, sort of like early stages of CPRA, where if we were GDPR compliant, then we were, CCPA compliant. Maybe we were overly compliant, but you kind of have that bleed over. So they might not be, what's that? It's cause and effect. They're related, but maybe not causation versus
correlation.
Thank you. Correlated, not causation. Thank you. Oh, my brain is totally on the downslide.
No worries. I totally get it. Okay, we have. I did want to ask this question that an attendee posed. I think it kind of speaks to a larger sort of perspective that businesses have, or wish could be the case. This attendee asked, are there any creative solutions without explicit consent? For example, can you have a banner with an OK button without the possibility for reject? And now I believe this would be an example of, at best, a dark pattern, if not just outright non-compliant with a lot of these laws. Skye and Mark, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that one's pretty tough. There have been explicit requirements around when an accept banner, when an accept is explicitly available on a banner, the same parity must be offered for reject. And that's sort of the parity piece. And that's more CPRA than anything else, or the more complex CPRA analysis, but CIPA as well. Parity is a big thing when it comes to evaluating the efficacy of a consent manager. If you offer an accept, it must be as easy to reject as it was to accept. So we see a lot of that in the EU, specifically the UK, the ICO has called that out specifically, parity and accept and rejection. So I do agree with Matt that the removal of the rejection option is likely a dark pattern, because it is sort of pushing a user towards acceptance with no clear rejection option. So even if you have a manage preferences and an accept all, that is sort of leading your customer through the majority of clicks. If you're clicking more to reject than you are to accept, that kind of has that transparency parity problem. But to Shane's point, in the chat, what I just noticed come up, it is also very, very state reliant, right? I'm from Pennsylvania, born and raised in Pennsylvania. They couldn't care less if you got an accept or deny on your cookie banner. California, Colorado, Virginia, they may care a little bit more. And they definitely care about the GPC signal being passed. So there is going to be some state by state nuance there as well. In the more litigious states, I would say an accept and reject parity is probably minimum best practice.
Okay. We have a few questions regarding CIPA requirements. The first here is, does CIPA require an audit trail, or is that a CCPA requirement? And the second question is, does CIPA explicitly require a cookie list specifying each cookie's type and description? So I grouped those together because they both seem to be about, generating a record, audit trails, disclosures. Yeah, Skye and Mark, I'm just curious about what your response is there.
My understanding is that CIPA doesn't require explicitly an audit trail. It doesn't call out, you must have maintain an audit trail, but that can obviously be extremely helpful if you were to receive a claim or if you need to prove that you did something, on time and did it correctly. So while it's not necessarily, called out in the law as being a requirement, it's very good practice to have that in the case that you do receive a claim.
Yeah, I think the two things on just that part to carry on to that is, or to add on to that, is that CIPA cases are usually going to have two factual questions that they're going to ask. They're going to ask, did interception or recording or whatever it was that was claimed against, did it occur? Like, can we prove that it happened? So can we prove that you're using a system that was sending data to company X? And then two is, did the user give valid prior consent before that moment happened, right? So the auditability in this case is more related to, do you have a record of that consent that you can pull up and say, well, see, this person gave consent for marketing, targeted advertising on this date, these categories. Here is the record that proves that. And then can we prove that this system is actually sending data to this downstream advertiser in the way that the defendant has claimed it has. But the audit trail overall is going to help, again, when consent was presented and accepted, categories of tracking that were enabled, making sure that nothing fired before consent. And if you were to exceed just that main claim and a user were to ask for a follow-up, their data to be deleted. Well, now I want to know all the information that you have on me because I don't trust that you're not sending my data to third parties. There then needs to be a secondary way for them to execute that right.
Right.
And then you had a second question in there.
Yes.
I did not answer. Oh, disclosure.
Yes, exactly. So we had an audience attendee ask about, does CIPA explicitly require a cookie list specifying each cookie's purpose and type and whatnot? And yeah, that's kind of whereas an audit is sort of happening after the claim. This, from my understanding, this is more of a, being transparent can protect you to a degree.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you agree or have nuance to add.
Yeah, this isn't, I wouldn't say that individual cookie disclosure is a requirement for CIPA, but what disclosure is transparency and visibility to your end users. There's been a lot of conversation around what level of disclosure do I need to put out into the world, and that comes more on like the GDPR side of the house. Ireland is very big on disclosure, but they have the concept of disclosing categories versus disclosing third parties versus disclosing individual trackers. And really, this is just a level of transparency and a level of risk aversion that you want to accept. At bare minimum, you should be disclosing the type of tracking that you're doing. That is like the categories of cookies, trackers, pixels that exist on your page. That's a bare minimum disclosure. The secondary bit would be making sure there's a full list of all third parties that are tracking users on your website. And then even beyond that, if you want to be a really great global citizen, that would be all three of these things: individual trackers, the third parties, like the sub processors, third parties themselves, and then the categories of tracking. So it's a level of transparency. Do you have to necessarily disclose every individual cookie, tracker, pixel that exists on your site? Probably not. But levels, categories of tracking for disclosure purposes, definitely best practice, especially if you're going to interact with any type of international workforce.
Great. We also had, I'm going to ask this one since it's pretty related. How does Osano specifically handle the development of like a cookie disclosure notice like we were just talking about?
Oh yeah. So a couple different ways. There's actually a bunch of different ways. One is the cookie consent banner itself has a what we call a drawer, a second level that you can open up and change your preferences in. There is a way to disclose the content right from within that drawer. So if a user wants to, they can go ahead and click on view disclosures and see every individual cookie that you've disclosed. We also have JSON files that allow you to take that content and make it into a table. And we also have an offering called Trust Hub, which again allows you to take that content, all of the cookies that you've already found, already wanting to disclose, puts it into a table and allows you to embed it onto your website. So there's a bunch of different ways that you might be able to use Osano to create a cookie table, or you can just use Osano's categories to ensure that you have a good map of categories of tracking or types of tracking you might be doing on a website.
Okay. And then I think this will be our last question. I'm just going to sum up a few kind of related questions here. We had a lot of attendees ask about, does this kind of information collection raise CIPA risk? Does if we get information from a customer during purchase and checkout, is that CIPA risk? If we're logging for bug fixing or auditing, is that a CIPA risk? My impression is that it's really all about if any of that data goes to a third party. I'm curious if there's anything to add there, or if that's more or less the end of the story.
Yeah. Most of it is going to be, does this go to a third party, or is it is it some sort of first party tracking? Oh, right. If you're using any type of SaaS offering, it's generally going to go to a third party, but it's the amount of what data is it collecting, and then what data is being sent, even though it might be collecting, first name, last name, email, what data is actually being sent to that third party versus what we're keeping on our side. A lot of the times it's all of the data is being sent to the third party, but there might be some mitigation depending on how you have particular SaaS offerings configured. That are more privacy forward, or maybe they're just getting a unique identifier that can't tie it to a particular user. It's anonymized data. There's no IP address being sent. But with these wiretapping laws, there is a lot of wiggle room, I would say, in terms of what would be considered a third-party transfer, because the tap and trace is dedicated to things like IP addresses and IP identifiers. And obviously almost every third party is going to be taking an IP address at some point. It's just, what are they doing with that data?
Right. Okay. Well, I think that's all the questions that we have time for. I want to thank everyone for showing up today and learning. And I want to thank Skye and Mark for sharing their expertise. It's a scary world out there, and the world of CIPA litigation. So stay safe, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, everybody. It was good to spend time with you today.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.